to be solved. So in the Purva Paksha, he identified the people who actually made distortions to Indian chronology. He identified what distortions they made, and he also tried to understand the motives of why they were distorting Indian history. So that was the Purva Paksha. So, and then in the Uttar Paksha, we covered the fact that he divided Indian chronology into four parts. Those four parts are the very ancient, the medieval, and the modern. And the very ancient is what we started covering last week. We did not complete it. I do have a couple more slides on it, which I want to cover today. And then the final part is the bulk of his research, about 22 books that he wrote on modern chronology. And that modern chronology, the time span is from the Mahabharata war to 1193 AD. And the reason he stopped in 1193 AD is that's about when the Muslim invasions began, and chronology and history from that point forward is very well documented. Most of the distortions were in the period between Mahabharata war and 1193. So that's a recap of what we covered the last two webinars. So today I propose to complete the very ancient portion of chronology, and then we can move on to the modern chronology, which is that between the Mahabharata war and 1193. Now, after last week's webinar, some people had posted questions, and I was not able to respond to that, and my apologies. It's because I have been busy, because I have had house guests from India, and they've been here for the entire week. So I've been busy with them and have not been able to respond to those two questions. But however, time permitting, maybe if you could ask those questions in the Q&A, I can try and respond to them. So with that said, let's go to okay. So we covered this is a sampling of the reference sources that Panditji used in his reconstruction, which includes Buddhist texts, Jain texts, even Persian texts, texts from Nepal and Kashmir. All this was for the purpose of triangulation, so that you can correlate dates and make sure that all references are reconciled. It is not very useful to take one source as a reference and then use and depend on the dates cited in that text without reconciling them with others. So in case there is a conflict, then that conflict has to be resolved. So sometimes you have to determine which one is correct. And so that is the rigor that goes into this kind of a reconstruction. And it's not an easy task. It's a very involved task. So today we will try to complete part one, which is the very ancient chronology or history. And then we will start the fourth one, which is the modern history from the Mahabharata war to 1193. I will try to go slowly here because there are some concepts that need to be understood, and then those concepts have to be applied. So without spending a reasonable amount of time understanding those, I don't think you will really gain much from this presentation. So that's why I think we should spend more time on the concepts first and then show how they are applied.
Can you make it full screen?
I will.
Thank you.
All right, so these were the sources that we covered in brief. And here is the structure of the universe that we talked about. We also talked about the Jyotish Chakra. And the Jyotish Chakra is the timekeeper in the Brahmanda. And we talked about how at the beginning, all the stellar and planetary systems reside in the Ashwini Nakshatra, which is actually in the Mesha Rasi. And then that's how Sruti starts. And at the end of a complete cycle, it is reset and they start all over again from the Ashwini Nakshatra and the Mesha Rasi. We also talked about the duration of the Brahmanda, and we talked about the time scale of Brahma. Then, of course, we talked about the kalpas of Brahma, and we also talked about the Manus. And in red here, we had tried to highlight the Svetavaraha Kalpa that we are in, and the Vaivasvata Manvantara that we are in. And of course, we've touched on the number system now. So I did mention that this is in our Nitya Sankalpa, that in our Nitya Sankalpa, we are incrementing the time elapsed since the beginning of Srishti every day, which is why it is a Nitya Sankalpa, because you have to increment it every day, or our count is going to become inaccurate over time. So what do we have in our Nitya Sankalpa? We have two things. We have a time and a place of the person performing the act, the karma. So every karma starts with a sankalpa, and in the sankalpa, you have to state the time, the date, and the place, and introduce yourself as the karta of that karma. That said, we covered the time aspect last week. This week, we will touch upon the place. So if you think about the Nitya Sankalpa, it says Sri Mahavishnu Rajnaya Pravartamanasya Adyubrahmanaha Dvitiya Parardhe Svetavaraha Kalpe Vaivasvata Manvantare Ashtavimsati Tame Kali Yuge Prathame Pade. So that bounds the time, and it sort of defines the time that we are talking about. And then we have to talk about where we are located, with Jambudvipe, Bharatavarshe, Bharatakhande, Meroho, Dakshina Digbhage. So we're in Jambudvipa, we're in Bharatakhande, Khanda, Bharatavarsha, and we are south of the Meru Parvata. And then depending on where you are, you typically try to identify rivers and other places to narrow down the geography of where you are. Krishna, Godavari, Yoho, Madhyadeshe. So if somebody living, let's say, between the Krishna and Godavari rivers, that would be the Krishna district, Guntur district, and probably East Godavari or West Godavari. So that's how you identify the geography. So now the question is, what is Jambudvipa? We have heard this name over and over again, but what is Jambudvipa? And here Panditji he provides a drawing based on his readings, and this is his reconstruction of what Jambudvipa is. So we're showing the Earth over here, but I do want to point out that this is an aerial view of the Earth. So what you're looking at is the northern hemisphere. So normally they show the globe from the side, and so you see the North Pole, you see the South Pole, and you see the globe, and you look at either the Eastern Hemisphere or the Western Hemisphere. But this is top down. You're looking at the Northern Hemisphere. So Jambudvipa in olden days in Sanskrit texts is the Northern Hemisphere of the Bhugola. And in the Northern Hemisphere, let's walk through this. So the Northern Hemisphere, this is the Northern Hemisphere that you're looking at. At the center, depicted by number 10, is the North Pole, which is also the Meru Parvata. The Meru Parvata is not a physical object. It is a virtual axis. It's a virtual vertical axis. So if you go back to the Brahmanda, so you see these 14 lokas. So the vertical axis that passes through all those 14 lokas is the Meru Parvata. So I just wanted to explain that first. Oh, where am I going? All right. So the northern hemisphere is the Jambudvipa, which is called the Surabhaga. And of course, the southern hemisphere is called the Asurabhaga. So that's where all the Asuras lived. And the northern hemisphere is Jambudvipa, where all the Suras lived. And in the olden days, Jambudvipa was a single landmass, and it covered Asia, Europe, Africa, North America, Gondwana, Lemuria, and even Atlantis. So for someone interested in geography, it stretched from 50 degrees west to 50 degrees east of Lankapuri. So let me slow down. So Mount Meru is in the center. So just for orientation, and that coincides with the North Pole. And then you see the 360 degrees that the circumference is divided into. And what you find is, if you think of longitudes and latitudes, and in the longitudes, you've all heard of the prime meridian. The prime meridian in those olden days used to pass through Hastinapur, Ujjain, Kanyakumari, and Lankapuri until the East India Company decided that's got to be British, and they moved it to Greenwich. And so we talk about GMT and Greenwich Mean Time, and all this is a recent appropriation from Hindu philosophy. So the prime meridian in the olden days used to pass through Hastinapur, Ujjain, Kanyakumari, and Lankapuri. So where is Lankapuri? So if you look at Lankapuri, it is at the intersection of the prime meridian with the equator. So the circumference you're looking at is the equator. So if that were the equator, and if this vertical line right here is the prime meridian, then the intersection of the prime meridian and the equator is where Lanka is situated. It is not Sri Lanka. Everyone today believes that Sri Lanka is Ravana's Lanka, but it's not. The actual Lanka is near the equator. It is at the intersection. And like I said, it passes through Kanyakumari and Lanka. That's the prime meridian, and it is at the equator. So I draw your attention to the fact that even in Valmiki's Ramayana, it says that Lord Hanuman went south from Mahendragiri, and Mahendragiri is Kanyakumari, not Rameswaram. Now, the fact is, if you were in Rameswaram, you would have to travel east to get to Lanka. But if you were at Kanyakumari, you would go south to get to Lanka. Plus, Hanuman traveled 100 yojanas. A yojana, one of the definitions of a yojana is approximately 5 miles. So 100 yojanas would be about 500 miles. So 500 miles south from Kanyakumari would put you at the equator. Now, Rameswaram, even if we assume Rameswaram was the starting point, you would still have to go 500 miles south. But you find that Lanka, Sri Lanka today, is actually only 65 kilometers east of Rameswaram, not south. The other point is Mahendragiri, which is Kanyakumari, was a mountain. There was a mountain called Mahendragiri, and at the base of the mountain is where the ocean touches the shore. Now, there are no mountains near Rameswaram. So, if you look at the primary source, which is Valmiki's Ramayana, it is clear that Sri Lanka cannot be the Lanka. So, where is Sri Lanka? And I think we've plotted it and decided it was at the intersection of the equator and the prime meridian. And I've labeled it here. And you can see the name here, Lankapuri. So, this is Lankapuri. So, we talked about this being a single landmass. We talked about Gondwana and Lemuria. Where are these? Gondwana is this landmass labeled 1, number 1. And this is the land between Africa and India. And this used to be a single landmass. What that meant was, in those days, you could actually walk from India to Africa. Lemuria is also a landmass between India and, let's say, Thailand and Malaysia. So that there was a single landmass, which meant that you could actually walk from India to almost Papua New Guinea, almost to the northern portion of Australia. So migration in those days was easy because it was a single landmass. There were no water bodies to cross, no rivers, no oceans, no seas. So that is what Jambudvipa was in very old times. So let's move on from here. And what is Bharatavarsha? So Bharatavarsha is, if you look at India over here, I've tried to identify 2 rivers here. One is called the Drishadvati, which is in blue, and the Saraswati, which is in brown. So when Srishti begins, then the holiest of holy places is the land between these two rivers called Drishadvati and Saraswati. And that land is called Brahmavarta. And that is where Swayambhu Manu himself becomes manifest, and the Sruti becomes manifest in this land called Brahmavarta. And over time, as the population of Brahmavarta grows, the population starts migrating because of excessive population. So they move from Brahmavarta to places, other places, and I name some of them here, called Aryavarta, Madhyadesha, Yagniyadesha. So from the beginning of Srishti, over time, although it starts in the Brahmavarta, it starts migrating through all over India, and that is how all of India gets populated. Now, and of course, there are some details as to what the neighboring countries were. So based on that, with the Himalayas bordering the north and the ocean bordering the south, you get an idea of what the geography and contours of India became over time. Now, Pandit Kota Venkatachalam, I think, was a pioneer in the out of India theory. He refuted the Aryan invasion theory, and he always maintained that the migrations were out of India, not into India. And he identifies three major migrations out of Bharatavarsha. One is to the east, which is to China and to Japan. So there was one huge migration that went to China, to Japan, because remember, that was all one solid landmass. And there was even the Bering Strait was actually walkable. And so he asserts that the entire globe was populated by these migrations out of Bharat. So we were talking about the eastern migration. So the eastern migration, he maintains, went through the Bering Strait and actually populated North America and South America also. We'll get to that in a second. There was one migration that went northwest from India, and those migrations sort of settled and colonized the areas of Greece, Rome, Europe, and Scandinavia. So that was the northwestern migration. And then there was one migration that went directly west, and that colonized Persia, what we know as Iran, Iraq, and all the way to Egypt and Africa and Assyria. So these are the three migrations that went out of India, and it was not one migration. These were continuous migrations over different points in time. And of course, he also maintains that there was a massive migration after the Mahabharata War. So this is to give you a nice overview of Jambudvipa. Okay, so we were talking about the migrations out of India. So who were the people that migrated out of India? You see, most of Bharatavarsha in those times there were kingdoms, and these kingdoms were ruled by Kshatriya kings who were devout and followed Vedic rituals. So over time, there were some kings that stopped following Vedic rituals, and these people were excommunicated, and then they were driven to the borders. In fact, they were driven out basically from Bharatavarsha. So they sort of settled in the northeastern corner, which is near the Sindhu River. So where do we find evidence of this? We find them in the Rig Veda. And in the Rig Veda, they're actually called Dasyus, which is at the top of the screen. Dasyus is the term the Rig Veda uses to refer collectively to the Kshatriya kings that stopped following Vedic rituals, that were excommunicated and driven out of India. Now, that's in the Rig Veda. So after the Rig Veda, they're also called the Anaryas. Arya in the Rig Veda means a noble person, meaning one that follows the Vedic rituals and follows his Swadharma. And so the people who did not do that were called Anaryas, to distinguish them from Aryas. They're also called Mlechas. So these three words are synonymous, which is why I put them in the title of the slide. Dasyus, Anaryas, Mlechas all mean the same thing. The Dasyu is introduced in the Rig Veda. The Manusmriti is where the tribal names are actually identified, and I list some of those names over here. The Paundrakas, Odras, Dravida, Kamboja, Yavanas. So I think Sudarshan Garu had a question about Yavanas, although I think he said Yadavas, but it was not the Yadavas, it was the Yavanas who actually migrated out of India and colonized parts of Greece. The Sakas, the Paradas, Pallavas, Chinas, Kiratas, and so on and so forth. Then the Harivamsa Purana also mentions these tribes. You may recall that Sagara Chakravarti, who was an ancestor of Lord Rama, Sagara Chakravarti, there are legends that speak about his conquest over these Dasyus, and the fact that he was able to defeat them in large numbers, and he drove them again to the northwestern corner of Bharatavarsha. So we find that in the Harivamsa Purana, we find them in the Mahabharata. You see, the Yavanas fought on the side of the Kauravas in the Mahabharata war. And there are the names of the Yavana kingdoms are identified in the Mahabharata war. Kashmir is mentioned in the Mahabharata war. So anyhow, so my point is that there is a tremendous amount of evidence that correlate and corroborate the fact that these migrations were out of India, and that the names were well known, and the portions of the globe that they actually colonized were well known. So when we remember in the first webinar, I mentioned that when Christianity spread from Israel to Northern Europe, what they found on their way, on that journey, were polytheists, people who believed in multiple gods. And that is whitewashing by the English. They didn't want to admit that the early settlers in those regions were actually Hindus. Hindus are polytheistic. So what they found were Hindus. And this is basically the basis for that, that these migrations happened out of India. So let me give you some concrete examples. The Yavanas. Yavana is a Sanskrit word. Now, in those days, the commonly spoken language was Prakrit. And Prakrit and Sanskrit had certain differences. So if you look over here, Prakrit had no la. And Sanskrit sa became aha, as an example. So Prakrit did not have the phonetic sound of sa. It did not have the phonetic sound of la. And so as an example, you see that Sindhu was pronounced as Hindu in Prakrit. And this is from very ancient times. So going back, so Yavana is a Sanskrit word. In Prakrit, Yavana was pronounced as Yona, spelled, let's say, Y-O-N-A. Of course, this is the Roman script, which didn't exist in those days. So if we looked at the Devanagari script, in Sanskrit, you would have written it as Yavana. In Prakrit, you would have written it as Yona. And these people settled eastern and southern Greece, which is a region called, well, I pronounce this Ionia, but you could reasonably pronounce this as Ionia. So I-O-N, it could be pronounced as ion, it could be pronounced as Iona. So the point is, Ionia refers to the region that was colonized by the Yonas or the Yavanas. And this is a direct correlation. These are the anglicized names of the tribes that colonized these regions. For example, the Kiratas. The Kiratas settled in a place which is now called Crete. So these are just examples. Now, the Sakas colonized the place called Parasaka or Parasika, which I think is the original name of what became Persia. So the Sakas went west and they colonized Persia. The Chinas colonized parts of China, and so on and so forth. So the point is, this is evidence of the migration. This is evidence of where they sort of settled, and this is the Anglicization, or well, of course, this was probably in Greek, but this is the English version of the Greek name for a Sanskrit name. So, any questions on this part so far? I'll probably pause here for a second.
Sir, I guess we would continue the presentation and then we would refer to this video and then note down questions and then ask you privately, I mean, through this chat or in the WhatsApp group what we have created.
No,
that would be better.
Yeah, who's speaking? Could you please introduce yourself?
So that's from here, sir. Because so much content is provided, so we have to.
No, I know. Yes, and because there is so much content, I want to go slowly over this. And I mean, I could cover all of this in 1 hour, but that would be too much information, and the retention would be small. And so, what I'm trying to avoid that, and so I want to go slowly over this so that you can all follow along and remember most of it. So the point is, and this is now, where does this become important? It becomes important because the Aryan invasion theory was an invention by Max Muller in 1850. There is no text in the world that talks about Aryans as a race before Max Muller, because Max Muller invented it. The reason he invented it is the Brits did not want to, I mean, they were a military superpower at the time because India was intellectually evolved. It was a peaceful civilization, not really interested in conquering territory by, it was not expansionist in any way, but the English were. And if you look at their history, it was a brutal history. And they're not known, most of Europe for that matter is not known for actually building anything. They are known for looting and becoming rich by looting. And that gave them some power. Because they had an army, they had power. So when they were colonizing India, the East India Company wanted to justify their colonization of India. And they said, well, we all descended from a common ancestor, and that common ancestor came from Central Asia, and he sort of came here, stayed here for 200 years, invented Sanskrit, did all this, wrote all this literature, and then also traveled to Europe. So they talk about these Proto-Indo-European languages, which I suppose you might have heard of, and that was the way that they sort of covered it up, because they want to hide the fact that they learned a lot from the Indians. And the Renaissance I've mentioned before, the 100 years was it's called the rebirth of learning, but the learning was basically translation of Sanskrit and Persian texts into European languages, and that's how Europe did most of its learning. And I would like to point out again that this was after 1100 years of barbaric times called the Dark Ages. And after the Dark Ages, it's surprising that these savages suddenly spent 100 years doing a lot of science and discovery. And the irony is that after 100 years, we never saw these superheroes again in Europe. It ended after the books were translated. So it's something, food for thought. If you look at those 100 years of the Renaissance and think about the time before and the time after, you wonder why we didn't see superheroes in Europe before and after the Renaissance. But anyhow, the point here is that if you look at Homer's Iliad, now, let's think about this for a second. Greece as a civilization, as a country, not as a civilization, but as a country, began to form around 1000 BC. And there are nuances here. So first I'd like to make this point about Iliad and Homer, and then we can talk about the actual geography. But Greece was beginning to be formed around 1000 BC. And around 1000 BC, they were fairly primitive. It was a very, very primitive region. And Homer, let's say, existed around 800 BC. So about 200 years before that region began to take shape. And in a civilization that was about 200 years old and was very basic and very primitive, his book Iliad describes a civilization that is far more advanced than the times that he was living in. So the point is, how is that possible? And so Pandit Kota Venkatachalam, on this particular point, his opinion is that this was civilizational memories that the Yavanas had taken with them when they left India. They still remembered the Mahabharata, they still remembered the Ramayana, even though in summary form, but then they remember the heroes, they remember the conquests, and basically this was an adaptation of civilizational memory, which it became a Greek classic. You'll also find that there was cremation in ancient Europe. You find that they had seamless fabrics. See, the thing in India is Indians did not wear stitched clothes. They did not wear tailored clothes. They wore single fabrics like a dhoti, like a sari, which did not require cutting and stitching. So seamless fabrics. So if you look at the very old Hollywood movies that show that refer to these older civilizations, you'll find that they wear tunics and they wear things like shawls, and they're all seamless fabrics. And that's another influence that went from India to the West. You also find a one-to-one correspondence in the gods. Is there a question? You also find that there's a one-to-one correspondence in Greek gods and Indian gods. Sir, could you please go on mute? I'm getting some feedback here. Could you all go on mute, please? So seamless fabrics, even knowledge, astronomy. So you find so much a similarity between what was known in Greece versus what was known in India. And the problem is the West has tried to brainwash us into believing that knowledge traveled from Europe to the rest of the world. But Panditji is saying, no, it's because of these migration, knowledge actually went from east to west. And this is a constant struggle, because people that have tried to make this point have been challenged to provide evidence and concrete evidence. Now, the point is, the irony in all of this is when someone says that knowledge traveled from the west to east, it is taken for granted. It is taken and assumed to be true. But the moment you say knowledge traveled from the east to the west, meaning from India to Europe, then suddenly the burden of proof and the standards of evidence suddenly become a lot higher. And we have to show more evidence than they're willing to show for their case to establish the fact that knowledge actually transferred from east to west rather than west to east. So in conclusion, Panditji says that the history of ancient Greece, which is what Homer refers to, is the history of Bharat. And that is why you find all these similarities, because this knowledge traveled with these people, their language, their music, their festivals, their culture, their legends, their folklore, everything traveled with them. And of course, it got diluted and lost over time. So yes, this is the point. The last point on this slide is what I wanted to talk about. I did say that the Greek region started developing around 1000 BC. But what you saw in the olden days is not a country called Greece, but you actually saw individual city-states like Sparta, like Athens, like Crete, Macedonia. So these were all city-states, and these city-states had their own regional identities. and people were very loyal to their city-states. They were not loyal to Greece as a country because the country did not exist. It was just a collection of city-states. But around the 5th century BC, is when they created a country called Greece, and they banned the use of terms like Ionia or Iona, and replaced it with the word Greek. And so this is very important to remember, because the term Iona, Yavana was not used after this decree was passed in the 5th century BC. Why is this important? Because when people try to date Ashoka, they find some pillar inscriptions, and in those pillar inscriptions, the Yavanas are mentioned. Now, if Yavanas are mentioned, then based on this last bullet on this slide, it had to be before the 5th century, because the term Yavana was not used after the 5th century BC. So anyone that tries to put Ashoka around 400, 300 BC has to explain how the term Yavana is used in what are called Ashokan inscriptions. So it's because of William Jones's mischief that he pulled Chandragupta Maurya from the 16th century to the 4th century. So Chandragupta Maurya, you'll remember, is the grandfather of Ashoka. So Ashoka was pulled from the 14th century down to the 4th century. And Yavanas existed in the 14th century. The term Yavana did not exist in the 4th century. So this is something to keep in mind. And this is something that Panditji highlights, which I've never found anywhere else, explained anywhere else. All right, so this completes the ancient history. So I just wanted to mention that these are the migrations that have been, I did forget to point out. Okay, so we talked about all of these tribes that migrated out of India, and we talked about the Yavanas. And the Yavanas have been mentioned in very old texts, even in the Mahabharata war. Even in the Mahabharata war, they talk about 5 Yavana kingdoms, and I highlight them in yellow. Abhisara, Uraga, Simhapura, Divyakataka, Uttara Jyotisha. These are the 5 Yavana kingdoms that actually participated in the Mahabharata war on the side of the Kauravas. Where are they located? And here Panditji draws a map, and I've highlighted Kashmir for reference in brown. And to the west of Kashmir, you find here is in yellow. You find the 5 Yavana kingdoms. So where my cursor is on the far left of your screens, Uttara is Uttara Jyotisha, Divya Kataka, and so on. So these are the 5 Yavana kingdoms, and this is where they were placed with respect to Kashmir. And you'll find that the Yavanas had populated Parasika or Saka, and that is in green. And I highlighted Persia over here in green, and this is where the Sakas settled, almost to the west of Afghanistan, what is modern day Afghanistan. So I just wanted to highlight these before we left this slide. All right, so that completes the very ancient portion of his research. So before we go to modern, I'd like to take questions on this. So I see a hand raised.
Yeah, Aditya has raised a hand before. Yeah.
No, yes. So somebody had raised a hand. Yeah, somebody had raised a hand. Yeah. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Guruji. Lakshman here. So, I had multiple questions, but one question is that, so all these migrations happened only from the northern part of India, is it? Anything from the middle or south part of India, any migrations happened like that?
No. These were large-scale migrations, and so if they had to leave from anywhere else, they would have had to contend with water bodies. And so the land routes were the easiest to migrate out of. And so people sort of, it's not that people picked a destination in Greece and migrated to Greece. I mean, these migrations were out of India. So they settled in the Yavana kingdoms that you see on your screen. They settled in Persia and they kept moving. They kept moving all the way to Greece. So they didn't go to Greece in one step. The point was they had to leave India because they were excommunicated. And so they started settling in these places. So this happened slowly and over large periods of time.
Okay, I understood in your topic that you also told that like Yavanas and all, they went to the different places and there also they practiced Sanatana Dharma for a considerable period of time. And after that, they stopped it. That is why they are called as the Anaryas like that, right? So if they practiced the Sanatana Dharma in the place where they migrated also for a considerable time, at the first place, why did they move? Why did they migrate? Actually, did they migrate in search of something, or they were expelled out of the country? What any logical reason behind they migrating to the other places when we already have so much of place and culture here? So, what was the need for them to go out and establish at the other place?
Yeah. The reason they migrated was because they were excommunicated and driven out of India. And the reason they were driven out of India was because these Kshatriya kings had stopped observing Vedic rituals. It does not mean that they became non-believers, but as an administrator, you have to uphold the culture of the region. So from that aspect, the duty of a king is to honor the religion of his kingdom. And so the reason these people were excommunicated from India was because the kings stopped doing Vedic rituals. So when you say practice Sanatana Dharma, you have to be careful in the use of your words. So you may stop doing what is your dharma, but that doesn't mean that you have lost your belief in your God.
Okay.
You may not go to a temple. You may not do Sandhya Vandanam any day. You may skip everything that you're supposed to do, but that doesn't mean you lose belief in your God. So if you migrate, now you've migrated, I suppose you live in the US.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So are you doing all the Vedic rituals that is expected of you for your dharma?
No,
Probably
not
not.
really.
Probably not. No, I didn't want to embarrass you, but you're probably not doing it. So according to that definition applied strictly, you are an Anarya, but that doesn't mean you've forgotten or lost your belief in your God.
Okay.
You see the difference?
Okay, so they might have done something more than this, right? I mean, whatever the example you are giving, they might have done something more than this and completely went against the dharma. That's why that expel happened.
Correct.
Can I consider that?
Expelled. Yeah. They were expelled, and it was primarily the kings. And when the king was driven out, then some of his subjects followed him. And so over time, these became larger and larger communities that decided to migrate.
It is interesting that you are saying that kings were expelled. How come a king can be expelled? I mean, there is not something superpower than the king, which made the kings to expel, right?
No, they have neighboring kingdoms. They have other kings, and the other kings also notice. I mean, these kings used to meet when there were large events and ceremonies, like let's say, there's a new king crowned in a kingdom. Then that is an event that other neighboring kings would be attending. Like, think about the Mahabharata. Think about the Rajasuya Yaga that Yudhishthira performed. Think about the number of kings that visited.
Right, right.
Now, the Mahabharata was a war fought between two cousins or families of two cousins. Or families of two brothers. But think about the number of kings that participated. The concept of Bharatavarsha has existed for a long time. There's a difference between a king and a Chakravarti, meaning a king and an emperor, a Raja and a Chakravarti. There's a big difference. And so it was that concept that kept all these people united and in touch. And so as a community, if you look at the kings themselves, as a community, they had their own meetings and they had their own peer group, and they could identify people who had stopped following Vedic rituals, and they probably collectively took these decisions that Bharatavarsha is the karma bhumi, and people who were not following the proper karma were driven out. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Sorry, I'm asking too many questions. One more follow-up on the same thing, actually. So when this kind of a significant things happen, and when we are able to capture Ramayana and Mahabharata for so long, and we are able to give that literature to the present day generation, so how come this part of decision of making some of the decision by the emperor making some of the kingdoms to expel, how come this part is missed from the mainstream literature?
What are you identifying as mainstream literature?
No. So basically, nowadays, the present day, we are able to find the literature of Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Bhagavatam, all these things, right?
Yes.
So similarly, because these are very significant things in the history of any country, right? I mean, expelling one kingdom from the native place and ask them to go out to some other place is definitely from the country point of view. If you think, it is definitely a very big significant thing. Such a big significant things or events, were they not captured in the literature? And if so, why? I mean, why we couldn't hear about that much?
Well, on this slide, I give you what Pandit Kota Venkatachalam identifies as references that talk about this. The Rig Veda, Manusmriti, Harivamsa Purana, Mahabharata, just to state a few.
Oh, okay.
There are plenty of other sources that talk about this. If you are talking about books that Macaulay's children wrote, and why these are not described, then we have to understand.
Now I understood. Now I understood. Thank you. Now I understood why we are missing that exactly. But yeah, understood. Because we stopped reading these Manusmriti, Rig Veda, all these things. That's why we are not aware of that.
No, because we not only stopped reading those, but the only thing we read are stuff that's written by Macaulay's children.
Yeah, I am totally with you now. Thank you.
Right. Very good. Any other questions?
Okay, please go ahead. Yeah, I'll come later.
Yes, Adityaji, you had a question?
Namaskaram, Shastri Garu.
Namaskaram.
Yeah. One thing, Shastri Garu, are these migrations and forced expelling people, are the reasons for those invasions happened in India? Or were they keeping the grudge and helping the other kingdoms to enter India and invade India?
I'm not sure what invasions you're talking about. What invasions are you talking about?
No, I mean the Islamic invasions and the British.
No, Islamic is very different. So you're talking about time after 1193 AD. I want to stay focused on the chronology between 3138 BC and 1193 AD.
Okay, Shastri. And one more thing, Shastri. So people who are habituated to tropical climates, so how did they reach those polar regions and sustain there? So how that was happened?
Yeah, so this is something that is confusing. And the reason it's confusing is that we are looking at what we see today, and we're projecting that 10,000 years, 20,000 years into the past.
Yeah.
And even climate goes through cycles. And when climate goes through, you've heard of the polar ice caps melting?
Yes.
Yeah. So the polar ice caps melt. And when the polar ice caps melt, sea levels tend to rise. When sea levels tend to rise, land tends to get submerged. Coastal areas get submerged. So in those times, the land mass that you see is less than what exists.
Oh, okay.
But when the polar ice caps reform, then sea levels drop and land gets exposed. And that happens over very long periods of time. So if we're talking about times very, very long ago, then maybe there wasn't as much ocean as we see today. Maybe because of global warming, we are seeing smaller ice caps, we're seeing more water bodies and less land. But if that water were to recede by 1 meter worldwide, a lot of land would be visible so all of a sudden.
Yes, sir. I got it.
Yeah. All right. Anyone else? Any other questions?
I think so. I can add one more thing here. That no,
Mhm.
if you see that the Vedic civilization, mostly it's at the Sindh region or Sindh River, and in Kashmir also, right? So there's it's colder, right? Even now also in Kashmir region, right? So there are so many big kingdoms in Kashmir and that region. So there are people who are accustomed to cold also.
I
Is
mean,
that
it's cold
right?
today. No, wait. It's cold today, but would you say it was always cold and never warm? See, if
Uh,
your climate also goes through cycle. I will also point out to you that they have found fossils of aquatic creatures like fish on top of the Himalayas,
yes, sir.
which
Yeah.
which indicates that the Himalayas were submerged at a certain point in time. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain how fossils of aquatic wildlife were found on top of the Himalayas.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that's something to keep in mind. And tendency tends to be that you're projecting what you see today into the past, and the past may not have been exactly like what we see today. So you have to account for the changes and what those could have been. I mean,
Yes, agreed. Yeah.
we talked about Gondwana, we talked about Lemuria. That was a single landmass, which means water levels are much lower than what they are today. You have stories of cities that are submerged. So if water levels dropped enough, you could probably see those cities.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions?
Shastri, were there any civilizations existed before these migrations happened in those areas?
No, because when Srishti begins in Brahmavarta, as we talked about. At the very beginning of Srishti, it starts in Brahmavarta, and then even Bharatavarsha is not fully populated at that point.
Okay.
So when Brahmavarta is fully populated, then you find migrations out of Brahmavarta into Aryavarta, Madhyadesha, and all this. So all of this is, Pariji has actually explained all of this very well. I'm trying to summarize this into half a slide, but in those 2 slides, I'm trying to summarize this entire book called Brahmanda Srishti Vijnanam, as well as this book called Manava Srishti Vijnanam. And this talks about the migrations, and it's hard to give more detail than this. I mean, I'm trying to give you a flavor of the kind of research that's done and the books that he has written based on that research. So for the interested reader, I would strongly recommend that you read these books, and that would probably answer most of your questions.
Yes, so I will order few on Amazon now.
I'm sorry?
I mean, I'm saying I will order on Amazon.
It's not on Amazon yet, and we haven't put it on Amazon yet because we've published 6 out of 24. I'm actually proofreading the 7th one right now and should be releasing it to the publisher. But right now, we haven't put it on Amazon yet, and it's hard for me to do it because I live in the US and the publisher is in India. So my logistical issues, but they're not on Amazon right now. So please contact me and let me know, and we can arrange for books.
Sure, sir. If it's in India, then I'm in India. I'm in Andhra only. I can get it.
Not a problem. I have a nephew in Hyderabad, and so you can get them from him.
Super.
Yeah, very good. I thought there was one other question, please. Maybe 2. Anyone have a question?
Sir, before you go for other questions, I would like to say that there's a time check. So it's already almost 1 hour. So let's not go into a new topic. Let's do Q&As. And after that, we'll stop here and continue in the next week. Is that okay, sir?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. So yes, I'd be glad to take any more questions that you might have.
Yeah, sir, I have not attended the last time, but I think from the last time information, I want to ask something. Like you mentioned about the number of years and Kali Yugam, Mahayugam, Manvantaram, and Kalpam, right?
Yes.
So in that, So above Kalpam, there is also Param. That's what I heard actually.
No, it's Parardha,
Parardha, not Param, is it?
not Param. It's Parardha is 50 years in the life of Brahma. So see at the very top, this is 100 years. This horizontal bar at the very top is 100 years on Brahma's time scale, and that is divided into half. Each half is called a Parardha. So 50 years on Brahma's time scale is one Parardha. And one
Oh, okay.
Parardha, yeah, one Parardha is divided into 14 Manvantras. I'm sorry, a Kalpa. Each Kalpa is divided into 14 Manvantras. So this is the breakdown.
Okay, actually, I heard something different, like 100 years, 100 kalpas. I mean, not 100 kalpas. The 100 years, one life of Brahma, that is called as a Param. Okay, it is different.
It,
Half of
it
the
could
life
be,
is called as a.
it could be. That is one Kalpa of Vishnu. So if you look at the bottom, the two bullets in red, so Brahma's lifetime is one Kalpa of Vishnu, and Vishnu's lifespan is 100 crores on his time scale.
Okay, okay.
All right. Any other? I thought there were two other questions.
Yes, this is Sonia. I had a question from your last session on the birth of Rama. So I think you mentioned that Rama was born in the Treta Yuga, but on the 23rd Mahayuga. Is that right?
24th.
24th Mahayuga. So, so there have. I thought that the avatars happen every yuga. So that's not the case.
No, that's not the case. That's not the case. In fact, the most authoritative to actually here, what Panditji does in this book is he actually talks about when each avatar actually happened. But what he has done is he has tried to show how many years from the date of his writing, meaning 1944 is when he completed this research. So how many years before 1944 each of the Dasavataras existed? And just by looking at the oldest, if you look at Matsya Avatara, Matsya Avatara, he says, is 12.5 crore years before 1944. So that is the very first, because remember the story of the Matsya Avatara. The Matsya Avatara is where the Manvantara is created. That's where Sruti, after a new Manu is born. Vayavasvata had to take charge of a Manvantara, and so the Matsya Avatara had to bring the earth back, the Bhugola back, so that Sruti could start again. So Matsya Avatara is the first one, and that is in the very first Manvantara. I'm sorry, in the very first Mahayuga of this Manvantara. And so my point is, if you look at the Brahmanda Purana or the Bhagavad Purana, these are described in detail. They tell you exactly which Mahayuga each avatar was in. So, for example, I don't remember them offhand, but I think the Varaha Avatara was in the 4th Mahayuga of this Manvantara. Parashuram, I think, was in the 19th Mahayuga. And Lord Rama himself was in the 24th Mahayuga, and Krishna was in the 28th Mahayuga. So no, I mean this.
Wow.
Yes. Okay. So if you read any of our Puranas, they actually identify which Mahayuga each avatara was manifested in.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, Lakshman. One more question, and maybe there is no diagram, but so this Divya Yuga is divided into the Satya Yuga. So how many Divya Yugas?
No, careful. Okay. Words are important.
Okay.
Yeah. So go ahead. So Divya, I would advise against using the word Divya.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So Mahayuga, just please call it a Mahayuga.
Okay, Mahayuga. Okay. So how many Mahayugas are in, is it one Manvantara has only one Mahayuga, or?
No, 71. 70, look.
Okay, 71. Okay. 71 Mahayugas in one Manvantara. Okay. Right?
So then 14 Manvantaras in one Kalpa.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. So that's where that 71. So we still have so many more Mahayugas to go. We are in the 28th right now. Okay.
That's right.
Makes
That's
sense. Thank you.
right. Any other questions? I thought someone was just about to ask a question.
Oh, okay. Okay, I was thinking that the cycle of all these avatars is happening in every Mahayugam. Like in Treta Yugam, Rama keeps coming like that. That's not the truth.
No, that's a common perception, but that is not accurate. I think
Okay.
the most authoritative source of information would be our Mahapuranas.
Okay.
I've actually found it. I actually did find, I think it was in the Vishnu Purana that I actually found, and it actually tells you which Mahayuga each avatara manifested in.
Okay. Okay.
Right. So if you go back to the source, that is the truth. That is the truth. That is the most authoritative information that we have. Now, what we have learned, sadly, in our English education, Macaulay's education, we have not been taught our own texts. And so we are unfamiliar with what our texts actually contain. What we have learned is what the English wanted us to learn.
Correct, Guruji. Yeah, thank you.
So maybe the different avatars happen in one Manvantara versus one Mahayuga.
Yes, that
probably.
Yes.
That probably makes more sense. Okay.
Right. Yes.
Any other questions on this topic?
So if you have any further questions, we need to contact in that group that is created, right? Reconstruction of that WhatsApp group. We can ask the questions, right, Guruji?
Yes.
Any further questions later point?
Yes, most welcome. So if there anything we can talk about today, we can. If not, most certainly put them in the WhatsApp group.
Sure, definitely.
Okay, I would like to.
In USA, how can I get most of this literature? Usually even in India, also in the bookshops and all, it is difficult to find this kind of books. So how can I find that in USA to read more literature on this?
Oh, I like I said, there are 24 books that he wrote, and out of those 26, we have published 6. Our goal is to publish all 24 so that it can be available as a set for anyone looking as an authoritative treatise on this topic from an insider of the tradition. And so that's the work what we are working on. We have published 6. Anyone in the US can get them from me. Anyone in India can get them from my nephew who lives in Hyderabad. So
I'll
please
contact
send
you.
me, please send me a private message you have my number in the WhatsApp group. Please send me a private message and I'll respond to you.
Sure, Guruji. Thank you.
Very good. Any other? I thought I saw someone raise a hand.
Yeah, it was just Lakshman and Sonia ji itself. No one else had raised a hand.
Very good then. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. We'll start a new topic next week.
Yeah, Sonia ji, can we close with a prayer?